Welcome to our conversation today. I'm glad to welcome Milena Lazarević. So welcome to our Western Balkans COVID dialogue, where we're going to be talking about the government responses, the implications of COVID-19 on the Western Balkans. So welcome, Milena.
Thank you, Florian. Glad to be here.
So Milena is the Program Director of the European Policy Center in Belgrade. And we're going to be focusing first on the kind of geopolitical implications. When the crisis began, the European Union, of course, was scrambling of how to respond. And very quickly, we heard statements by the Serbian president that China is now the big friend of Serbia. He welcomed aid deliveries, and that the European Union was just a fairy tale. Is this a policy shift, or was this just some kind of spontaneous outburst at the beginning of the crisis?
Yeah, I think this is maybe the most interesting question, and this has been on the minds of all of us who deal with the EU integration and international relations in Belgrade. And there has been a lot of discussion about this. I would say that, first of all, friendship and sympathies in Serbia towards China are nothing new, and we used to hear that many times in the past. So in that sense, I don't think that this was the main surprise. I think that the main surprise for everybody was really the moment which the president chose to pronounce that European solidarity was a myth, was a fairy tale, and that we could not count on the European Union. We are all aware that this was probably the most watched national address that the president has had since the beginning of this crisis, because this was the moment when he was announcing the start of the state of emergency. So I think that every family, every household had their TV turned on and was watching that. So I think that the choice of moment to utter those words was very, let's say, interesting, to say the least, to use a euphemism. At the same time, I do tend to think that this was an emotional outburst and that this was not a planned statement. We have seen afterwards some attempts, definitely not sufficient, including the last night's appearance of the president on the national broadcasting service at 8 o'clock in the evening, 8:15 in the evening, when he did mention that the European Union has also been very helpful, and that European partners have been very helpful. This was another, let's say, another moment which was very important, and a lot of people were watching, because everybody was waiting to hear whether this weekend we would have the long curfew, 3-day long curfew. And yeah, for some reason, it is usually the president who tells us what is going to happen first. So we can see that, this was not a real policy shift, but at the same time, I think that the choice of moment and the choice of words in this first national address can be characterized as quite worrisome and to an extent irresponsible, because this is not just any random thing that a citizen has said. This is something that has affected deeply the mindset of the Serbian citizens. We have seen so far there have been few thorough polls done with the Serbian population. We have seen in one of the polls, which was not representative, and where I have to say that the question was asked in such a way that there were too many options offered, but for the countries that were offered as possible answers for who was the most helpful to Serbia in dealing with the COVID crisis. Many more citizens, I mean, the percentage of people who responded to China as opposed to US or EU was significantly higher. We will see, and I'm sure that new surveys and new polls will emerge in the coming weeks and months, and we will see what is the real effect. And I think that everyone is looking forward to the next regular poll of the Ministry of European Integration, which is done twice every year, in December and in June. So we will see what will be the effect in June, and to what extent the support of the Serbian citizens to EU integration and their awareness of EU's support will have shifted, will have changed in June.
I mean, after that statement, I mean, the EU has also been kind of going a bit more on the offensive in terms of communicating its assistance to Serbia. Did you think that this kind of more visible EU assistance has actually been effective, or has it helped to change the narrative in the public and in the public perception, or is in a certain way the high visibility of China dominating everything which happened afterwards?
I think that high visibility of China is still dominating the public perception. Unfortunately, the channels through which the subsequent messages regarding European integrations, European Union's support have been communicating, they're much more limited in reach. We can also see that after this national address, the president has also used his Twitter account. He has also used some targeted interviews to communicate EU's support. But what is interesting to observe is that those were not the most widely watched national media. This is not something that was communicated on the most watched TV stations, and certainly not with this kind of coverage. So we can always see this choice of communication channels and choice of messages according to the communication channel and the audience which follows that communication channel. So we obviously can see that the president has been more welcoming and more outspoken regarding EU support, but in those media which is followed by maybe people like you and me and our colleagues working on EU integration and international relations. I'm not sure that this message has reached the Serbian population more broadly, and certainly the EU's communications and all their communication efforts, they do not have that kind of reach. So yes, the EU has been much, let's say, on the offensive in terms of communicating. They have also been much more careful, I have to say. I'm definitely one of the people who was critical of the European Union's first response in the moment when they forgot basically about the Western Balkans when taking the decision about limiting the export of medical equipment. And I think that this was simply a mistake, but one that they should learn from, and that I think they have already learned from. I think they have already shown that they have learned from it. At the same time, I think that it is profoundly unfair for anybody, even the president, to compare the actions of China at the moment when they have already dealt with the crisis at home, and when they're the ones appearing as somebody who can now export and provide their expertise on what they have already done to contain the virus at home, and compare those actions with the actions of the European Union at the moment when the crisis is only just starting and when the EU is trying to scramble on a response to the whole thing, which is just emerging. So those are two very different points in time, and nobody was actually analyzing what China, especially here in Serbia, nobody was analyzing what China was doing at the very beginning of the crisis when they were forced to, think of the first responses and start managing this crisis. And there are a lot of questions in that part that we have not had the proper answers to. So I think that there is really a problem with making any sort of a comparison. But at the same time, I think that the EU has actually been quite effective and quite rapid in putting its act together, realizing that if it is to prove its geopolitical aspiration, and if this commission especially is really going to prove its geopolitical adjective in their setup, that this aspiration has to start with the Western Balkans, that this is the first testing ground for how capable they are to actually act as a geopolitical actor.
Yeah, I think these are some key points you mentioned. I mean, I also felt that, the response was interesting, considering that, of course, when it happened, the EU was dealing with Italy was the country which was the worst affected in the world at that particular point in time. So it's more understandable that Italy felt let down by the EU than Serbia would at that particular moment. But
yes, certainly so. And I think that the damage that was done to the European Union's image and credibility in Italy is much worse actually than it is in Serbia. And we have seen actually that the drop in support to the EU in Italy has really been yeah, quite surprising. I mean, very, very, very serious.
Indeed. I'm just wondering, I mean, to which degree has there been, I mean, of course, not much in terms of regular EU integration process has been occurring over the last 2 months, but do you see, or do you kind of get a sense that there is a change in the dynamic as a result of all of this, or is basically everybody anticipating that things will just return to the, you know, not very successful path we had before, but just kind of to business as usual, and this is just going to kind of fade in the you know, as an unfortunate statement, and both sides will go back to the, you know, the status quo before the crisis.
Yes, well, at this point, I think this is probably still difficult to say, and I think that we may be able to make a better assessment after the Zagreb summit, which of course nobody has very high expectations of, considering that it will be done through a video conference and considering that the MFF has not been adopted, so not very many, let's say, novelties and measures will be published and will be known with this summit. At the same time, it is interesting to see that, for example, Serbia is the only country in the Western Balkans which decided not to use the EU's assistance for macro financial assistance, MFA. The Serbian Minister of Finance said that we simply don't need it. I'm not an economist, so I would not like to comment in more detail on that, but we did find it surprising that this kind of help, which was offered to Serbia and which was gladly accepted by all the other countries in the region, that Serbia has not taken it, whereas at the same time it has decided to do some borrowing inside of the country, which in the previous crisis was shown to be a very negative policy, which actually did more damage to the private sector than it did good. Now we will see what will be all the intricacies and all the complexities of these economic decisions. But for example, this is one possible, let's say, indicator of where Serbia is or will be looking for further help and support. If we see in the coming months that Serbia raises new loans somewhere in the east, then that might be a good indication that something is shifting in the course of the country. If not, then we can expect probably the return to the business as usual, which, as you said yourself, over the past years has been rather sluggish progress, doing the minimum necessary to maintain some appearance of the progress in the process, and never, let's say, taking an extra step or making an extra effort. The good thing is that, of course, in this whole situation and at the very start of the crisis, that the Council of the European Union did open accession negotiations, or take the positive decision to start accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, which will, let's say, also definitely have some positive repercussions in Serbia as well, in terms of showing that the EU is still committed to the region. And I think that a little bit more competition also in the negotiations with North Macedonia possibly coming in as some sort of a fast track actor, that maybe some positive competition could happen. And let's hope that in the same way that he likes to compare us and say how successful we are compared to our neighbors in economic development, in our financial stability, etc., that maybe our leadership and our president will also be interested in showing, let's say, a more positive competitive approach in the real progress in the accession process. This could be an interesting kind of a race.
good competition is always can be always very productive.
Yes. Peer pressure, more peer pressure.
Exactly. And I think that's what many of us have been arguing for many years. That in fact, the more negotiations are going on at the same time, the more countries will try to prove that they are better prepared and doing a better job. But do you also see? Because there's been criticism of the kind of the emergency measures taken in Hungary, but also in Serbia by the European Union, by members of the European Parliament, for example. There have been some critical voices. Do you think that there's also going to be a shift, that the EU might be more critical now because some of these emergency measures are not extraordinary in the terms of what happened before and what happens elsewhere, but it maybe highlighted some of the democratic deficiencies in the country. Do you see the EU becoming more vigilant about this as well in Serbia, or do you think again that there's more of going to be a return to kind of don't ask, don't tell policies?
Yes, well, this has definitely depended on the EU institution we're talking about, and obviously members of the European Parliament have been more outspoken, whereas other EU institutions, especially the EU delegation in Serbia, they have been, let's say, more reserved, and of course, as diplomatic representatives, they are, let's say, constrained to an extent. But at the same time, I think that a positive signal is that when concerns were raised, for example, about the complete cancellation of the work of the parliament in the middle of the crisis, that suddenly a session of the parliament was organized, and suddenly we saw that this was possible. So I mean, in the same way in which it was unclear why the parliament was unable to meet in the first place and declare the state of emergency, in the same way now it was not clear how now suddenly it was able to meet, because let's say the situation was not yet relaxed. It was not yet the end of the measures. It was not yet the end of this wave of epidemics in Serbia. So it is unclear, and I would say that this was done as a result of the international pressure which was created and appeals that the parliament, there was really no need to suspend the work of the parliament in these circumstances. I think that, you know, in the big scale of things, considering the largely worrisome picture, I think this can be treated as one positive signal, because you can see that there is a reaction when there is a clear message sent from the EU. Indeed, we just had the meeting of the parliament, which confirmed the decisions taken by the government in the state of emergency. What was also, I think, promising, and let's see whether it really ends like that, was that it seems that the state of emergency will end quite soon. Many of us were worried that the state of emergency could be extended for a longer period than necessary, but it seems that this will not be the case. So I think that there will be a lot of questions, and a lot more questions asked once the state of emergency is abolished, especially about the constitutional legitimacy of the way that it was proclaimed in the first place. Then perhaps challenging some of the decisions taken during that state of emergency, but at the same time, especially in terms of human rights and similar and limitations to the human rights. But at the same time, I think that if we really see that the state of emergency is ended very soon, that this will again be, let's say, one positive message in this overall relatively bleak situation. I think that the most concerning thing over the past months has been that we have seen the president dictating all the measures in all of the areas where he does not have the actual constitutional competencies. And I think one of the most worrisome things is whether we will start going back towards, let's say, a more controlled constitutional setting, or whether this will become, as now everybody uses this term, so I cannot avoid it, it's the new normal. It is the new buzzword everywhere, but indeed, we already, before the state of emergency, we had situations where the president was acting outside of his constitutional role. And we have seen much more of that over the past 2 months. So it was not the prime minister who was communicating things, but it was always the president, regardless of whether it was economic measures, regardless of whether it was basic public health measures, etc. So I think this will be one of the main challenges and the main tests for the Serbian democracy in the coming period, whether we will go back towards more respect of the constitutional roles, or whether these developing tendencies and trends will continue.
Thanks. Yeah, so maybe in closing, one last question I'd like to ask everybody is, how has your work life, as a program director at a think tank changed in the last 5-6 weeks? How has that routine been affected in terms of your work life, so to speak, in doing your job?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, I landed in Serbia with my family from New York on the 15th of March. We were the crazy people who visited New York for a week, just at the beginning of the chaos there, when we were unaware of it. And we landed, and immediately it was clear that the whole office would need to shift to remote work. It turned out to be actually a very good experience, very positive experience. We even did an internal survey of our staff, sort of a COVID check-in survey to see what's working, what's not working, what people like about this, what they don't like about this. I can say that as for most of my other colleagues, especially those who have families and children, the biggest problem has been, having kids at home and working and helping them with school, and also, having to take care of the house and everything. So we have all been tested for our multitasking skills, definitely. On some days it has been particularly hard, and at the same time, dealing with the psychological pressure of the lockdown. And yes, and for everybody, actually, because of the way that the emergency measures have been established in Serbia, for everybody, actually, grocery shopping became one of the key challenges and the most stressful things, because since the curfews were starting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon for the biggest part of this state of emergency, people had to go and get groceries during the working hours. So we came up with ways and people to communicate, and we gave them flexibility and everything. But at the same time, we have managed to organize our work pretty well. And I can say that, for us, there has actually been much more work, not only because of the homeschooling of the kids and everything, but also because in addition to all of our already ongoing initiatives and projects, we have really tried to become, to be involved and relevant as an interlocutor and participant in the management of this crisis and analyzing the situation. So, the workload actually sort of doubled maybe in this period. But at the same time, I think, it has been also interesting to, not travel for a while. I'm somebody who travels a lot for my work, so it's been interesting to, be with my kids every day for 2 months. This is something that didn't happen for a long time before that. So there were ups and downs and positive and negative sides, but
I think exactly
we've managed.
Yeah, I think this sounds very familiar, and I think this is how many of us are experiencing it. And of course, in 20 years from now, we'll all look back at the golden days of the
COVID.
because of course nostalgia, makes every memory distorted. But indeed. Yeah. So Milena, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Florian, and good luck with this initiative. And stay well, stay safe. I won't say stay at home, because I hope that we won't have to stay at home for a very long time now.
Yes. Thanks. Same likewise.
Okay.